Now there's one of the few words, a word like Timbuktu perhaps, out of Africa, which rings familiar to most Westerners. There are some sound and less sound reasons perhaps for that. In any case, we see things like Hollywood movie productions. Michael Caine's first movie was called simply Zulu. Another movie, Zulu Dawn with Burt Lancaster. These were both about episodes in the 1879 war between the Zulu kingdom and the British, and probably it was that war, Rudyard Kipling's poem written in the aftermath where he saluted the courage of the, by that time, defeated Zulu that first put the Zulu word on the Western map. And it's multiplied ever since and shows up in some surprising places. In the 1980s, a 10-hour, no less, TV series on the king we'll be looking at today, Shaka Zulu. And in much more silly fashion, you find it showing up in the form of the so-called Zulu king and Zulu queen on Mardi Gras Day in New Orleans, wearing costumes that I must tell you have no resemblance at all to traditional Zulu attire. I come from North Carolina, and we've got a prominent bluegrass band down there called the Red Clay Ramblers, who have one of their crowd favorites has a lyric that actually combines our two terms. It says, how did the Zulu soldier lose the Battle of Timbuktu? He couldn't wahoo, wahoo, wahoo. Now, it's an interesting lyric. The Timbuktu and the Zulu heartland are about 4,000 miles apart. Nonetheless, it kind of shows the currency that this term has had. Let's bring it back to a historical basis today. In the last lecture, we described a changing and expanding Cape Colony. And while that society's frontier was moving decade by decade north and east towards the southern Bantu world, the societies of that world, the world to the east of that 20-inch rainfall line, were changing in dramatic fashion as well. In the next lecture, we take up the collision between the two, the frontier history between the Bantu and Europeans. In this one, we want to examine the southern Bantu transformation occurring on the eve and overlapping somewhat with that collision, centered on the Zulu story. For nearly a half a century, from the late 18th century, very late 18th century, through the first decades of the 19th, the peoples and communities of the southern Bantu world experienced revolutionary change, marked on one hand by disruption, upheaval, and turbulence, on the other by creativity and innovation. For a long time, the whole process has been referred to by scholars as the so-called Mfokane. Actually, if I were to pronounce that correctly, it would be something close. I'm only going to try this once. To Mfokane. There would be a clicking sound there, and again, as is so often the case, and we've seen it a couple of times already in this course, language tells us something about history. We know that Khoisan languages, the original languages in southern Africa, had a whole variety of clicks. Well, the southernmost Bantu languages like Zulu and Mandela's language, which should be pronounced something like Xhosa, with another click, actually borrowed four basic clicks. Borrowed into their southern Bantu languages sounds that are originally from an entirely different language family, the Khoisan. This, of course, is a linguistic evidence of a long history of interaction and coexistence, etc., between the two language families in southern Africa. All right, back to the Mfokane. The direct translation of this word from Zulu would be approximately the hammering or the crushing. Now, some have objected to this term in the sense that it connotes only the negative and violent side of this process of change. I happen to agree with that view, but since no one has suggested a useful alternative to refer to the whole process of change over a half century or so, I'll continue to use it, despite its loaded nature perhaps, and put it in quotation marks. Now, if you'll permit me, I'd like to fast forward for a second, cut to the chase, as it were, and enumerate three main ways that the Mfokane process altered this southern Bantu world by the time that it had played out. First, we go from a large number of small-scale states, chiefdoms, seems as good a term as any, to a smaller number of large-scale ones. This was a process of political consolidation. And we find the emergence of considerably more powerful and larger kingdoms in its aftermath. Second, as elsewhere in the world, there's most definitely a military side to this consolidation. That's certainly been in the making of major powerful states. This is usually the case. It's certainly been the case in most of the major states of Europe. It's certainly the case in the making of the American nation. So it should not surprise us that that would be the case here. These larger units did involve an intensification, an increasing centrality for the art and science of military warfare. The ethnic map, and this is my third great change, the ethnic map of southern Africa was remade. It was recast. Ethnic identities expanded and contracted. So we see once again the notion of fluidity of identity, as we did in our last lecture when we talked about the birth of Afrikaner and colored identity. Some people definitely relocated. You can go to parts of southern Africa today and hear languages that were originally spoken in source areas hundreds of miles away. We'll look a little more closely at that further on. So again, political consolidation, the construction of larger kingdoms, a more serious and central role for military arts as part of that process, and a reshuffling, a recasting of the ethnic map. Now, let us return to our focus here on the kingdom which, in a lot of ways, is at the center of this process, although I want to stress throughout that the Zulu story is only a part of this enormously wide-ranging transformation that affects the entire subcontinent. Now, the story of Shaka and the founding of the modern Zulu kingdom illustrates, in a way, all three of the dynamics I just talked about. Shaka and those around him were part of the Nguni subdivision of the Bantu, who lived between the Drakensberg Mountains and the Indian Ocean. This is the area, the province of South Africa today, known as KwaZulu, which simply means country of the Zulu. Again, isiZulu, the language of the Zulu. It's known as KwaZulu-Natal today, Natal coming from a name for the old British colony in that region. Now, Shaka's life story has provided endless fodder for psychohistorians, most of them amateur, and it's easy to see why. It's a fascinating tale in the telling. Both his adult personality and his childhood experiences were unusual. They were outside of the mainstream or typical experiences, you might say, for his time. And as psychohistorians, amateur or not, like to do often, the linkage between the childhood experiences of younger life and the adult personality is sort of the substance of the analysis for many. Now, as an adult, Shaka was reputed for his driving ambition, his fierce determination, and his iron will, in some accounts for his outright cruelty. He evidently never married, nor had any recognized children. Again, well outside of the mainstream experience there. Well, let's go back to his roots for a moment. Shaka was born almost certainly in 1787. His father was the chief of the Zulu, the monarch of the Zulu. But, and this is quite important to our analysis today, I think, Zulu meant something very different at that point. It only referred to a small chiefdom there in that strip of very hilly, rolling, beautiful subtropical land between the Drakensberg and the Indian Ocean, only to one small chiefdom, perhaps 4,000 or 5,000 followers, subjects of Shaka's father. And this was one among a number of small-scale states and chiefdoms in this part of the Nguni, the southern Bantu world. Shaka's father's name was Sinzanga Kona, and we'll come back to him in a minute. Now, his mother was a woman named Nandi, and again, this figures prominently in a number of the popularizations of Shaka's life. She was a strong-willed and self-reliant, to put it mildly, woman from the neighboring Langani community, which we don't need to be terribly concerned with. Now, if Shaka's parents, his father Sinzanga Kona, the youthful Zulu chief at the time of his birth, and his mother Nandi, if Sinzanga Kona and Nandi ever married, and some of the oral sources do say that they were, others say they were not. If they were, it did not last. This was not a lasting union. And in fact, Shaka was raised by his mother, Nandi, very much under her wing, rejected by the Zulu royal house, and raised in, therefore, in a sense, in exile, estranged from the Zulu royal line. At that point, it might be nice to go to a document which is based on Zulu oral tradition. Of course, powerful states generate more oral tradition. So there's a great deal of oral tradition about Shaka. And frankly, you get differing views about Shaka that come through that. I'm giving you a rendering by an early European translator and collector of some of these translations. But you can see how the notion of how did the child affect the man here, the childhood affect the man, would come into this. This is supposed to be an account based on Zulu oral tradition of Shaka at, let's say, age 7 or 8, something like that, and so on. Let's go to it. It says, Zulu children dearly liked to lick the porridge spoon. The bullies of the family would find great fun in thrusting this stirrer into the fire, and then, when almost burning, ordering Shaka to peel off the porridge, saying, "Come, eat this, that we can see whether you are indeed a chief." And of course, this is a reference to his alienated father. Or when he would return from herding the cattle for his midday meal, they would force him to hold out both hands extended side by side like a saucer, into which they would pour boiling dollops and compel him to eat, threatening him with punishment if he allowed the food to drop. Then his little crinkled ears and the marked stumpiness of a certain organ were ever a source of persistent ridicule among Shaka's companions, and their taunts in this regard so rankled in his breast that he grew up harboring a deadly hatred. At that point, in some accounts, you could almost fill in the blank, hatred toward X, Y, anyone who was not supporting. Well, you can see with accounts like this why the amateurs would certainly have a ball with Shaka's life story. Now, the world that Shaka grew up in was already beginning to change. I mean, he doesn't drop out of the sky one day and transform southern Africa. He had predecessors and he had successors. He had peers who were engaged in some of the same things that he was engaged in, and that is this political consolidation and militarization of southern Bantu life. Now, one of his predecessors was Dingiswayo, who created a loose confederation of a number of northern Nguni chiefdoms, including that of Shaka's mother and the Zulu of Shaka's estranged father. Dingiswayo also started down the path of greater centrality for military life by injecting an element of military training into the initiation process of the so-called amabuto, which is the Zulu word for age sets or age grades, which we talked about in Lecture 6. At about age 15, 16, something like that, boys enter manhood officially by going through initiation schools and so forth. And Dingiswayo injects an element of military training in this, and in fact, these age sets, these amabuto, become the units, the regiments of his army, and we might call them age regiments at that point. So Shaka first distinguishes himself as a soldier in one of Dingiswayo's age regiments. Not every great general starts out as a great soldier. I mean, some do and some don't. In this case, he did. He's definitely caught the eye and the favor of Dingiswayo, who in fact elevated him at quite an early age to become the commander of his age regiment. Now, in 1816, Shaka's estranged father, Senzangakona, died. And with Dingiswayo's patronage, his support, Shaka returned and seized the Zulu chieftainship. In the 10-hour special that I mentioned, made for TV and filmed in South Africa, by the way, in the 1980s, this is a very dramatic scene, as you can imagine, where the rejected boy is now the towering, charismatic man, and he's come back to claim his birthright. And as you can imagine, he does so with some violence in the TV version. In any case, Shaka returns and takes the throne of the Zulu, if you like, although bear in mind that the Zulu is still only part of a larger confederation under Dingiswayo. But when Dingiswayo died in 1818, Shaka was well positioned to move into that vacuum left by Dingiswayo's death as well, and that he does. So in 1818, we enter into Shaka's one and only decade of real power. He took Dingiswayo's loose confederation and intensified the consolidation of power around himself, and certainly elevated the role of the military. Shaka's army used a new and shorter stabbing iron spear, a much larger oval shield. These were designed for infantry advance, and something quite reminiscent of the old phalanx and so forth. He housed his regiments in separate stockaded towns, and in theory, he wanted a regulation which would forbid his soldiers to marry until they were 40, and they would be rewarded, again, like Roman soldiers of old after their period of service with a sinecure and the permission to marry. Now, certainly many died in the path of Shaka's army, or armies, as he engaged in the expansion of this state. But the survivors were not, in general, massacred or enslaved, provided they accepted Shaka's authority. In fact, they were incorporated into the appropriate age regiments. And I should mention that there are female age regiments, which very definitely play a supporting role in these military efforts. So a captured or surviving male or female in one of the communities in Shaka's path would be incorporated and absorbed into the appropriate age set regiment. So a process that we might crudely term, and I admit it is a crude term, we might call Zulufication, if you like, was underway. People gradually who were not Zulu at the time, certainly of Shaka's birth or boyhood, in a sense and to varying degrees, became Zulu. They were dropped, in a sense, into a Zulu cultural bath. Shaka insisted that the particular praise poetry and so forth of his Zulu roots be adopted by the rapidly growing numbers under his rule. It shows again the fluid nature of ethnic identity, how it can expand and contract. And in a lot of respects, this is the key to the fact that Zulu today is the largest single ethnic identity in South Africa. So Shaka, therefore, in my view, was a builder as well as a destroyer. He built a new nation. He built a new kingdom. And for a time, at least, he inspired as well as compelled loyalty. Now, the military campaigns of Shaka and others, because again, the Zulu was one of several similar experiments going on at about the same time, created the threat of insecurity over a wide region. How would people and how would people's leaders respond to that? We already noted those captured and incorporated. Now, certainly some people and some whole communities fled in destitute and desperate conditions, so desperate that a few are remembered on the high veld in the interior of South Africa as practicing cannibalism. One of the rare instances of this in Africa, despite the stereotypes otherwise. Now, others mobilized military and politically themselves, in a sense, in response to how do we offer security in a time of the threat of insecurity. One of those was Moshoeshoe, the founder of the modern Sotho kingdom of Lesotho, and we'll take a closer look at him in our next lecture. Some took to the road, and I don't mean in flight or out of fear and in desperate conditions. Rather, they were, in a sense, states on the march. If you go to Western Zambia today, that Lozi kingdom I mentioned at one point, in some contrast to my old friends the Tonga in Western Zambia, the language spoken there is actually a language brought there by a people originally from the Sotho country who moved about 1,000 miles northward and established themselves on the upper Zambezi. Several branches of peoples known as Ngoni have settled far to the north in Malawi, Zambia, even as far north as southern Tanzania. And these can be seen as part of the sort of ripple effects, the kind of domino effects, the kind of shock waves, if you like, of this Mfecane process. And finally, I just might mention the Indabele. It was founded by Mzilikazi, who was one of Shaka's lieutenants, actually, one of his commanders, who proved to be mutinous and, in a sense, took his followers then away from the Shaka-dominated center, crossed the Limpopo eventually after stops on the way, and created a Zulu-style kingdom in southwestern Zimbabwe. We shall meet the Indabele people again in a later lecture. Now, meanwhile, Shaka himself met his end. After his mother's death in 1827, he seemed to lose the acuity of judgment that had marked his earlier reign. Always one to push, to prod, to expect, to demand from his followers. It may be that he pushed too hard, sending expeditions into the very tough, pestilential in some ways, country of southern Mozambique, for instance, where a classic sort of quagmire situation developed. After his mother's death in 1827, as I mentioned, he seems to lose that judgment, and it may have been a matter of time before he was overthrown. That came on September the 24th, 1828, and Shaka was assassinated by a party of conspirators that included a couple of his half-brothers, that is, sons also of Senzangakona, but by a different mother. One of those half-brothers was Dingaan, who succeeded Shaka on the Zulu throne in 1828. Now, Shaka's legacy has always been significant in South African history, and it's always been contested. Hero or villain, and sources from the traditional ones all the way down have shown elements of each. Apartheid-era whites tended to paint him as a bloodthirsty tyrant, just the sort of thing to expect without white rule. Others saw and see him today as greatness itself, and wrap themselves in his mantle. I mentioned Mangosuthu Buthelezi, the leader of the Inkatha movement in South Africa. I think it's fair to say a quasi-Zulu nationalist movement in South Africa. And when I say wrap yourself in Shaka's mantle, On public occasions, Buthelezi sometimes literally does that, and very much takes on the sort of apparel that is reminiscent of Shaka himself. Now, the turbulent change of the Imfakani has prompted the serious question, of course, of origins, which historians are always talking about origins, right? What started this ball rolling? You know, what conditions, after centuries of what appears to have been relatively settled, relatively peaceful, and relatively prosperous life in this part of the southern Bantu world, what is it that leads to this rather explosive period of change? Now, some have argued that our old friend long-distance trade is the key here, specifically in this case, trade coming in and out of the port of Delagoa Bay, the seat of the capital of modern-day Mozambique, lying to the north. The argument goes that the pursuit of control over access to prestige imported goods, again, the old Indian Ocean connection there, inspired or impelled, was incentive, you might say, to mobilize military and politically. Now, another explanation I suppose we could call an ecological one. And the investigations into this were prompted by some mentions in the Zulu oral tradition of famous famines. And again, all over the world, people have often marked times and periods by natural calamities such as this. Now, one of these cropping up in the Zulu oral tradition, seemingly occurring at some time in the late 18th century, led some quite enterprising, I must say quite original researchers in southern Africa to undertake an unusual form of research. They investigated essentially calcified tree rings. And what they were looking for, of course, was evidence of years. They could date the trees fairly carefully with radiocarbon dating, but looking for evidence, in essence, of wide rings where it was a good growing season, and therefore the ring would be relatively wide, reflecting a season of good growth, as opposed to very narrow ones indicating periods of low rainfall and possibly drought. And their theorization, contributing to the origins of the Imfakani debate, would go something like this: that a series of good agricultural seasons led at some point in the late 18th century to an expansion in both human and cattle population, that this is followed by a series of calamitous seasons of low rainfall and drought, and that therefore the greater numbers of people and cattle had to mobilize to control and compete for those limited resources. Finally, we must mention the radical revision of Julian Cobbing, who in 1988, in an article, proposed an entirely different explanation for the whole process of the so-called Imfakani. Cobbing argued that this actually had, in particular, the depredations or the downside of the whole Imfakani process had very little to do with African state building at all, that it was largely connected with an episode in slave trading organized either through Delagoa Bay or from the Northern Cape by Europeans. Now, this, as I say, was certainly a dramatic revision in understanding of the Imfakani. I must say that, in my view, Cobbing's work has not stood up well. The evidence for his chronology is simply weak. But have no doubt, the whites were coming. And that is the subject of our next lecture, The Frontier. Thank you.